In this lecture, we will be reviewing the development of industrial agriculture and the Green Revolution. We will be reviewing the types of food that we consume and how they are cultivated and raised. The manner in which we choose to produce food has a clear and important effect on both human health and the environment. Therefore, we must choose wisely or suffer the consequences. The learning outcomes for this lecture are as follows. Understand the problems that arise when farmers apply too much water to their fields and use excessive amounts of fertilizer. Understand the pesticide treadmill, which involves increasing use of pesticides. Define and understand genetically modified organisms, GMOs, and describe the level of GMO crops that are cultivated in the United States. Soil is the foundation of food production, but there are many other critical factors. Reliable water resources, nutrients, favorable temperatures and rainfall, productive crop varieties, and the mechanical energy to tend and harvest the crops are also essential. Strategies for applying these different inputs vary greatly among regions and among contrasting farming strategies. Agriculture uses at least two-thirds of all fresh water withdrawn from rivers, lakes, and groundwater. Although estimates vary widely, about 15% of all cropland worldwide is irrigated. Some countries are water-rich and can readily afford to irrigate farmland, while other countries are water-poor and must use water very carefully. The efficiency of irrigation water use varies greatly. In some places, high evaporative and seepage losses from unlined and uncovered canals can mean that as much as 80% of water withdrawn for irrigation never reaches its intended destination. Poor farmers may over-irrigate because they lack the technology to meter water and distribute just the amount needed. In wealthier countries, farmers can afford sometimes extravagant use of water, including center pivot irrigation systems. They can also afford water-saving methods such as drip irrigation, which waters only the base of a crop, reducing evaporative losses. In this photo, we see a pivot irrigation system. These systems deliver water to most U.S. farm fields. These systems create green circles in the landscape that you can see in aerial photos of the Great Plains. It is estimated that 20% of all irrigated land is damaged to some extent by waterlogging or salinity. Waterlogging occurs when farmers apply so much water to their fields that the soils become saturated and roots die from lack of oxygen. Many irrigation systems use water from deep wells or other sources with high amounts of dissolved salts. This may not be an immediate problem, but as water evaporates, it leaves the salt behind that can eventually form a salty crust that is toxic to plants. Water conservation techniques can greatly reduce problems arising from excess water use. These include drip irrigation and other water conservation methods. Plants require small amounts of inorganic nutrients from soil. In large-scale farming, fertilizers are used to ensure a sufficient supply of these nutrients. The major elements required by most plants are nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and calcium, with lesser amounts of magnesium and sulfur. Nitrogen, a component of all living cells, is the most common limiting factor for plant growth. Phosphorus and potassium can also be limited in supply, so nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are our primary fertilizers. Much of the doubling in worldwide crop production since 1950 has come from increased inorganic fertilizer use. In 1950, the average amount of fertilizer used was 20 kilograms per hectare. In 2000, this had increased to an average of 90 kilograms per hectare worldwide. An easy way to remember the function that each nutrient plays in the plant is to use the saying up, down, and all around. Nitrogen, the up, keeps the part of the plant you see green. The phosphorus, the down, maintains healthy roots and internal energy, and potassium provides all-around vitality. Over-fertilizing is also a common problem. Growing plants can use only limited amounts of nutrients, and the nutrients not captured by crops run off of the field or seep into groundwater. Excess fertilizers contaminate drinking water and destabilize aquatic ecosystems. Phosphates and nitrates from farm fields and cattle feedlots are a major cause of aquatic ecosystem pollution. Nitrate levels in groundwater have risen to dangerous levels in many areas where intensive farming is practiced. Young children are especially sensitive to the presence of nitrates. Using nitrate-contaminated water to mix infant formula can be fatal for newborns. This is called blue baby disease, and infants turn blue from lack of oxygen in their bloodstream. The nitrates bond irreversibly with hemoglobin, preventing oxygen from being absorbed by the blood. The food system in the United States consumes about 16% of the total energy we use. Most of our foods require more energy to produce, process, and get to market than they yield when we eat them. Reliance on fossil fuels began in the 1920s with the adoption of tractors. Energy use increased sharply after World War II with the invention of nitrogen fertilizer produced from natural gas. Reliance on diesel and gasoline to run tractors, combines, irrigation pumps, and other equipment has continued to grow since then. David Pimentel of Cornell University has calculated that each hectare of corn produced in the United States consumes the equivalent of 800 liters of oil, 5 barrels of oil. 1/3 of this energy is used to produce nitrogen fertilizers from natural gas. Another third is inputs for machinery and fuel. The remaining third is used for irrigation, synthetic herbicides, and other fertilizers. After crops leave the farm, additional energy is used in food processing, distribution, and storage. It has been estimated that the average food item in the American diet travels 2,000 kilometers or 1,250 miles between the farm that grew it and the person who consumes it. For some foods, processing, storage, and distribution use even more energy than growing the crop. Biological pests reduce crop yields and spoil as much as half of the crops harvested every year in some areas. Modern agriculture depends on toxic chemicals to kill these pests. There are concerns about the types and amounts of pesticides we use, but our reliance on them has grown steadily over the years. Pesticides are thus important to us, but indiscriminate use has serious effects. Chemicals drifting or washing away from fields endanger non-target species. One of the most urgent consequences of heavy reliance on pesticides has been the evolution of pesticide-resistant varieties of weeds and parasites. As discussed in Chapter 2, a species' traits can shift if environmental conditions change. In the presence of pesticides, a few tolerant individuals often survive and reproduce, and tolerance of the pesticide can become dominant in a population. New pesticide-tolerant varieties of weeds or parasites then emerge. Around 400 different cases of pesticide-resistant weed populations have been recorded by the Weed Science Society of America. In this figure, we see an example of the increase in one herbicide, glyphosate. Estimated agricultural use of glyphosate in 2012 is shown in the map, and the graph shows the increase in glyphosate application from 1992 to 2012. Spraying pesticides by air is quick and cheap, but toxins often drift to nearby fields. Pesticide-resistant varieties have increased, resulting in a pesticide treadmill, in which farmers use increasingly expensive combinations of chemicals to suppress weeds, diseases, and pests. Food production, since the latter half of the 20th century, has exceeded population growth, providing food resources to billions of people. But how was this achieved? Part of it was due to the industrialization of agriculture, applying industrial production techniques to farming. This has included increased use of fertilizer, increased irrigation, exponential increases in pesticide use, and the introduction of genetically modified crops, or GMOs. The use of these new crop varieties has been termed the Green Revolution. As a result, we feed more people with less land because we have maximized the food per acre. Let's look at this in some more detail. So far, the major improvements in farm production have come from technological advances and modification of a few well-known species. Yield increases often have been spectacular. A century ago, when all maize or corn in the United States was often pollinated, average yields were about 25 bushels per acre. In 2009, the average yield from rain-fed fields in Iowa was 182 bushels per acre, and the irrigated maize in Arizona averaged 208 bushels per acre. The highest yield ever recorded in field production was 370 bushels per acre on an Illinois farm, but theoretical calculations suggest that 500 bushels per acre, or 32 metric tons per hectare, could be possible. Most of this gain was accomplished by use of synthetic fertilizers along with conventional plant breeding. Geneticists laboriously hand-pollinating plants and looking for desired characteristics in the progeny. Starting about 50 years ago, agricultural research stations began to breed tropical wheat and rice varieties that would provide food for growing populations in developing countries. The first of the miracle varieties was a dwarf, high-yielding wheat developed by Norman Borlaug, who received a Nobel Peace Prize for his work, at a research center in Mexico. At about the same time, the International Rice Institute in the Philippines developed dwarf rice strains with 3 or 4 times the production of varieties in use at the time. The spread of these new high-yield varieties around the world has been called the Green Revolution. Semidwarf wheat, on the right, bred by Norman Borlaug, has shorter, stiffer stems and is less likely to lodge or fall over when wet than its conventional cousin on the left. This miracle wheat responds better to water and fertilizer and has played a vital role in feeding a growing human population. Green Revolution miracle crops are really high responders, meaning that they have excellent yields under optimum conditions. For poor farmers who can't afford the fertilizer and water needed by high responders, traditional varieties may produce better yields. In this photo, a researcher measures growth of genetically engineered rice plants. Superior growth and yield, pest resistance, and other useful traits can be moved from one species to another by molecular biotechnology. Proponents predict dramatic benefits from this new technology. Researchers are now working on crops that resist drought, frost, or diseases. Other strains are being developed to tolerate salty, waterlogged, or low-nutrient soils, allowing degraded or marginal farmland to become productive. All of these could be important for reducing hunger in developing countries. The dominant transgenic crops are engineered to tolerate high doses of herbicides, allowing fields to be sprayed for weeds without affecting the crops themselves, or to create their own varieties. Another dominant herbicide-tolerant crop is Agravo's LibertyLink crops, which resist that company's Liberty herbicide, or glyphosate. Because crops with these genes can grow in spite of high herbicide doses, farmers can spray fields heavily to exterminate weeds. This allows for conservation tillage and leaving more crop residue on fields to protect topsoil from erosion. Both good ideas, but it can also mean using more herbicide in higher doses than might otherwise be used. Another widespread use of GM technology is to insert genes from a natural soil bacterium, Bacillus thuringiensis, BT, into plants. This bacterium makes toxins lethal to Lepidoptera, butterflies and moths, and Coleoptera, the beetle family. The genes for some of these toxins have been transferred into crops such as corn to protect against European cutworms, potatoes to fight potato beetles, and cotton to protect against boll weevils. Because Bt crops produce their own insecticides, farmers can spray less. Growth of genetically engineered corn, cotton, and soybeans in the United States is shown in this figure. HT, or herbicide-tolerant varieties, tolerate herbicides such as glyphosate or Monsanto's Roundup. Bt crops contain insect-killing proteins from the bacterium Bacillus thuringiensis. As you can see for this chart, GMO crops now make up the majority of corn, soybeans, and cotton in the United States. Since HT corn makes up 70% of the corn produced in the United States, it is not a question of if you have eaten GMO corn, but how much you might have eaten. Consumers have long worried about unknown health effects of GMO foods, but the United States Food and Drug Administration has declined to require labeling of foods containing GMOs. The agency argues that these new varieties are substantially equivalent to related varieties bred via traditional practices. After all, proponents say, we have been moving genes around for centuries through plant and animal breeding. Biotechnology may just be a more precise way of creating novel organisms than normal breeding procedures. Despite continuing debates, direct effects of GM foods on human health remains unclear. Official studies have tended not to find clear effects on humans. Opponents of GM crops argue that studies have been biased or incomplete. The question is likely to be disputed for some time. Industrial agriculture applied scientific industrial management techniques to growing food. It is large-scale, capital-intensive, and highly mechanized. It uses large amounts of water, copious amounts of fertilizers to maximize growth, and an astounding amount of pesticides and herbicides to control weeds and pests. Industrial farms, like regular factories, focus on one or two specific crops or animal species, a monoculture, instead of trying to raise many crops simultaneously with farm animals. And industrial agriculture makes use of genetically modified organisms to achieve high growth rates and pest resistance. The benefits of industrial agriculture has been the ability to feed the world, but many people have doubts about the long-term benefits and concerns about the long-term damage caused by industrial farming techniques.